So, welcome back to Everything Marketplaces, where we talk with founders and leaders from some of today's top marketplaces. So, this is episode 160, which is a really great group chat that we just had with Andrei Hagiu. So, Andrei is a leading marketplace and platform researcher and is currently an associate professor at Boston University. So, Andrei has published numerous academic research papers on marketplaces and also frequently shares blog posts on his Substack, which are commonly referenced to founders. So this is great to change it up and have a more academic mind join us for a group chat, where we started off by learning more about what led Andrei to the research and academic field, why he's focused on marketplaces for nearly 2 decades, what make them great businesses. We did a deep dive into lots of topics like network effects and defensibility, discussed the impact AI will have on marketplaces, and also had a great group Q&A. I really enjoyed this conversation, and you're going to find it a great watch to the end. So, Andrei, welcome to the group chat. And I think this is the first time we've had an associate professor join us here as a guest. So I'm really excited to have you join us today. And we'd like to start off by saying a huge thanks for taking the time to do so in advance. So we have lots of topics that we're going to talk about. But before we really jump into things, I think it might be great if you can start off by briefly sharing your background for those that might not know you outside of your research papers and posts.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me. This is the perfect community for me. I'm glad I discovered it. Very brief background. I'm an academic. I'm pure academic in a sense. So I did my PhD, and it turns out this was like early 2000s. And I just came across, people in academia were starting to talk about network effects and platforms. I got super interested. And then I basically ended up doing my PhD dissertation on platforms. And at the time, there were very few. There were a couple marketplaces like eBay, Alibaba. So like we're talking 2004. And, then it was already quite interesting. And of course, as the years went by, there's more and more, and it became clear that this is like a really, really interesting field to be in. And I basically continued doing all my research, my teaching, and in the last few years, angel investing and consulting on platforms, but more specifically marketplace businesses.
Yeah, no, that's a really great background. So thanks for sharing with us on that. So before we kind of jump into some of the topics, I guess, what led you to kind of focus on marketplaces, I guess, for nearly 2 decades? And, why do you think they're great businesses?
So again, I started from a very academic angle. It's interesting. I think it was very clear from the beginning that I would say the economic properties of marketplaces, network effects, low cost, the fact that you are orchestrating interactions that you don't have full control over, they just behave differently from normal businesses, right? And I thought it was very fascinating. There was early signs, like pricing is interesting, all that kind of stuff was quite interesting and quite novel. And I was definitely it was interesting academically. And of course, it became clear that it's also interesting from an entrepreneurial perspective. And, it was just going to lead to more and more businesses being created, more and more marketplace businesses being created. Of course, the technological evolution helped that as well, like mobile and so on.
No, certainly. And so you have shared a post that I mentioned right before we started recording that I wanted to touch on a little bit because it's come up here with founders in the community more recently, which is the kind of a transition from a product or service into more of a marketplace. So could you kind of walk us through that and what some of the main considerations are when doing so?
Sure. This is one of my favorite topics. So how do you take regular products and services and turn them into platforms, more generally marketplaces in particular? So I'll keep it short and sweet here. So if you're thinking just like as a marketplace founder, so marketplace perspective, we all know marketplaces are hard to start, right? If you're trying to start from day one as a marketplace, you got to get buyers and sellers. There's chicken and egg problems. There's lots of issues. So in some situations, what happens, there's a way, basically you can start as a pure product or service and later on turn it into a marketplace. There's some good examples of this. OpenTable is a good one, started as sort of point of sale systems for restaurants, then became marketplace, and there are others, right? I think so. What's interesting there is like, I'm not sure that all the companies that have done this were deliberate about it. So maybe initially I just want to be SaaS or POS for sellers. It's like, oh, like now we have an opportunity to become a marketplace. Why not, right? But I think now that we understand this, I've certainly encountered marketplace founders where it just seemed like a good idea to think about. Is it easier to start maybe by offering a standalone service to one side and then more easily transition to a marketplace later. So I approach it from that perspective.
Yeah, no, as I mentioned, it's something we're commonly discussing here, and it kind of goes both ways.
Sorry, just actually, I would add one more thing there. So a little bit, one more nuance sort of to give founders something to think about. So one of them is just pure product to one side or the other. A slight variation of this is what I call like start as a reseller or a retailer. So think of like Amazon in the early days. There's no marketplace. They're buying and reselling stuff, right? So like instead of saying, hey, buyers and sellers of books or other services, come and join my marketplace, which again is an inherent chicken and egg problem, it's an easier conversation, at least, to sidestep the chicken and egg problem by just going and buying the books and selling them in your name. So that's another way to do it. Uber initially, right? I mean, they basically hire drivers. You hire the drivers, you pay them, you guarantee a certain amount per hour. They work for you, and then you get a bunch of riders, and then later on you turn and say, hey, we don't need to guarantee payments. You're just a free agent. You just get paid based on the number of rides you make.
Yeah, no, those are a great example. So you mentioned a few topics that we're actually gonna, I want to expand on, and I think that's actually a good kind of segue into another post that you shared in the community more recently, which is around 6 questions that you ask, when evaluating the potential for marketplaces, and then also some other kind of considerations such as defensibility. So could you kind of walk us through that post and maybe even expanding on some of those questions?
Sure. So this post, it's a short post. The good news, this is forthcoming as a Harvard Business Review article, and I think it's the July-August issue, so like in a month and a half or something. And I will share it with the community, but I'm very happy to share sort of like in advance to go through the questions. So let's see. So might keep me disciplined here. I'm not sure like I remember the exact order, but if you have it, we can go through it. But essentially, so we start. I mean, the first question is. It's actually what I should mention, the spirit of these questions, which is very important, is less about strategy and more about evaluating the potential of a marketplace, right? So let's say maybe I would say it's most relevant for investors, but also for founders to sort of evaluate the best case scenario of the opportunity they're pursuing. So, you have a marketplace is like, assuming you do everything right, how big and how defensible can this be? That's kind of the spirit. I'm happy to dig into the strategy questions as well. So the first one is basically saying, okay, well, yes, every marketplace has network effects, but really, how strong are the network effects of this particular marketplace you're pursuing? And I mean, the answer to this, I mean, I know there's lots of so VCs and investors. There's a lot of good measures. So they always look at total addressable market and things like that. So I think those are useful. I think the difficulty though with marketplaces is like, especially early on, it's a little bit hard to measure potential. So when you evaluate total addressable market, usually what people say, well, let's look at the service the way it's done today and say, well, if we capture, I don't know, 1% or if it shifts to a marketplace. I think one issue, so I think it's useful, by the way, certainly something useful to do. What I would say is for marketplaces, the idea is like, if the marketplace really works, you're basically bringing online untapped supply. And therefore the market is quite different. So, I mean, I'll give you an example. Think about Airbnb. Actually, I like a better one, the more recent one, which I like is Swimply, which is literally Airbnb for swimming pools. Quite amazing. It's doing very well. So with Swimply, you can say, well, what's the total addressable market of people renting swimming pools from other people? And you might say, well, let's look at, how many people go to swimming pools and how often, how much do they pay at public swimming pools, right? Sure, that's going to tell you something, but I think the behavior that Swimply is enabling is going to be much different. So yes, there's a bit of that. There's substitute. You're going to get some of that. But I think part of it is like, imagine now that you can rent all types of different swimming pools in your neighborhood from private individuals. And those are like really cool swimming pools. And people can they can have a grill and toys and stuff like that. I think the behavior that's going to be enabled is quite different. My point is actually the market should be quite larger if it works well. So again, I think it's useful to rephrase these questions as more like, what would happen when untapped supply comes online and so on. And then the other piece of this question, which I always like to ask, is basically to translate, is to basically make it very pragmatic, is to say, well, measuring network effects is very hard. How about what's the potential earning for sellers or for suppliers on this marketplace? That's probably easier to get at. So if this marketplace works, how much do you think a typical supplier is going to make, a seller or supplier is going to make on this marketplace? And of course, that number has to be meaningful. It depends on the type of marketplace, but it has to be meaningful in order for you to be able to attract those suppliers, right? It has to be a meaningful economic opportunity.
You mentioned a lot of great points there. So I guess is that that's kind of covering one of the first questions. If we kind of jump over to the next, can we kind of walk through those?
Sure. Next one would be, say, are the network effects global or local, right? So this is global network effects is Airbnb. Hopefully that's obvious, right? I mean, Airbnb gets better the more hosts they have for travelers, the more hosts they have in all countries and vice versa. You take something like, I don't know, TaskRabbit or Thumbtack, it's mostly local because you just care about people in your area. Now, those are obvious. What's interesting, there's some marketplaces where they're kind of in between. And point is, like, there's lots of shades of gray. And again, there's sometimes, for example, you can have people that move between locations, right? So if you have like the same buyers or the same sellers moving between locations, then it's actually your network effects extend beyond your city, beyond local, right? And there's some interesting examples of this. So you can ask, well, how many people are present in different locations, so on. In order to make that, how to say, a little bit clearer, a better way to ask it, I think, is when you move your marketplace to a new location, say you start in a city, let's move to the next city or to the next country or the next region. Do I get any advantage in terms of network effects from my existing cities or regions? And I think that makes it very clear. In some cases, you can say, oh yeah, definitely. My install base helps me because whatever, those buyers and sellers are active across multiple locations. And you can measure that. You can say, okay, well, how many of these are present in multiple locations and so on. So I think that's obviously it's a useful one to have in mind. What else? Another question is around, how much value does the marketplace add, right? So again, I'm sure we can open up to questions. There's lots of ways in which marketplaces add value, but I would boil it down to two fundamental aspects. Number one, marketplaces help people discover each other. So they help buyers discover sellers and vice versa. So there's the discovery element. And the second element is once you've discovered a trading partner, they help you transact in a more efficient way, hopefully, than you could otherwise, right? And it's interesting. Some marketplaces, by the way, are just pure discovery. So I don't know, like my favorite example is Craigslist. They do nothing to help you conduct the transaction. There's no payment system. There's no ratings. There's nothing. But it's very good for discovery, right? They just do discovery. Other marketplaces are mostly focused on enhancing your transaction, but there's little in the way of discovery. For whatever reason, either you already know the parties you're going to transact with or the discovery happens somewhere else, right? So I'm thinking like Patreon or Substack or something like that. Sure, you can discover, but people kind of discover their creators somewhere else. And then they tell you, hey, come to my Patreon or come to my Substack and subscribe to my newsletter or like pay me there or something like that. So I think it's useful to have those in mind. I mean, ideally, if you're a marketplace, obviously you want to do both. So there has to be both discovery and there has to be, you have to add value by making transactions on your marketplace more efficient than they would be otherwise. And that obviously enhances network effects and defensibility.
Yeah. So another point on there that you also mentioned as far as, asking how difficult it is to kind of switch platforms or a multi-home or, sometimes referred to as like multi-tenanting.
Yeah. So the multi-homing question, I'm sure many of you can relate to this. So, I mean, obviously what you want if you're a marketplace, it's like, I want buyers and sellers to be exclusive to me. Ideally. Unfortunately, that's not always possible. So you always have to think about, okay, well, imagine there's another marketplace or other marketplaces. What can I do to provide incentives for people to, if not just be solely participate on my marketplace, let's say spend most of their activity on my marketplace? And I would say, I mean, again, you can think of lots of ways to provide those incentives. The one thing I want to mention here, it's something that I feel very strongly about, I see a lot of marketplaces default to financial incentives. So it's basically, you can basically, honestly, you can always pay people and they'll be exclusive. But I think we all realize that's not sustainable. So a good example of this is Uber and Lyft burning through billions of dollars to basically just steal customers from each other back and forth. I don't think that was a very constructive way of doing it, because you offer loyalty, you offer discounts, and then once you stop the discounts, you're back to basically, well, I still have to compete for those customers. So in general, giving discounts is kind of financial incentives. I don't think it works very well. Ideally, what you want to do is to provide incentives that are non-monetary. So for example, let's say you tell sellers, you make it very clear to sellers that the more transactions they spend on they have on your marketplace, they appear higher in search results. So they get more business from buyers, right? They get recommended buyers more, or something along those lines. By the way, that's costless for the marketplace to do. It's just like tweaking, like using the algorithm to tweak in to favor people that spend more on your marketplace. Or having the ratings and review, like if the ratings and reviews are very good and really matter, well, obviously, like, so think about Airbnb. There's Airbnb, there's VRBO, there are many others. If I'm a host, sure, you can post your many hosts have their property on all of these marketplaces, but a lot of them actually just prefer to be on Airbnb. Not because, I mean, of course they can manage across different marketplaces. It's a little bit inconvenient, but you can manage it. The issue is you'd rather have all your transactions on Airbnb because there's significant advantages to your reputation and to the business that you get in having all those transactions and all those positive reviews on one platform, as opposed to splitting them across multiple platforms.
That's it's gonna be super helpful. So yeah, definitely something we've recently been talking about as far as I would say like supply side, just sticking to one platform to kind of accrue that rating and reputation there, or ratings and reviews and reputation. So cool. So we've covered some of the initial kind of questions for our considerations for founders to think about kind of the potential of their marketplace, and how investors could kind of evaluate that. So I wanted to jump over to maybe some of the specific opportunities. So are there any I would say like kind of markets, industries, or maybe specific opportunities for marketplaces that you see right now?
So, I mean, obviously, if I had like very specific ones, I would do them, or I would invest in them. So I would love to know those. Again, there's a reason I'm an academic and not necessarily like a startup founder. But that being said, I mean, I spend a lot of time angel investing. I've invested, I think, at this point in like more than 200 companies, most of them platforms, quite a few marketplaces. I mean, my sense, and I think you've heard this with your previous guests, is that there's a lot more opportunities for B2B marketplaces. For reasons that are fairly obvious, is that, well, there's a lot more competition, I guess, like, among founders to go for consumers. B2B, you need some experience in those industries, and also in B2B, there's a lot more, there are a lot more inefficiencies, right? So like, what you want, like, where do you think the marketplace opportunities are? Well, it's usually business industries where they're using antiquated technology, transactions are inefficient. There's these chains of intermediaries, right? Like the proverbial, like wholesaler number one buys from the supplier, sells to wholesaler number two, to wholesaler number three, and so on. So I think there's a lot of industries, and I see this all the time, like in sort of deal flow that I have, it's usually B2B. So I think there's a lot more there. That being said, I'm sure there will be like, there has to be some like super interesting ones and consumer facing, especially as we have like new technologies with AI and VR and so on, blockchain.
Yeah, a lot of interesting opportunities. But as I mentioned, yeah, the penetration rate is so low with B2B marketplaces. So, so somewhat a related topic to that, is when it comes to kind of opportunities as far as, AI. And of course, you've seen the rise of AI. But, you've also shared some pretty good posts as far as, how AI will impact marketplaces. So, I guess, like, could you share a little bit more on that with us?
Sure. So, I mean, I think there's definitely lots of interesting action at the intersection of AI and marketplaces. So, first of all, I think if you think about established marketplaces, what's going to happen? Like, what's the impact of AI on them? I think generally speaking, and there's always exceptions, but generally speaking, marketplaces that touch what I call like touch the real world, so like Airbnb, Uber, and stuff like that, they're less likely to be disrupted, and they actually can benefit, again, depending on how good they are at embracing, they're typically pretty good. I think they have a lot to gain from embracing AI to make the experience faster, easier. By the way, actually, I think so. One of the things you can do with AI, if you already have a marketplace, so again, with a marketplace, you have network effects. So think something like Airbnb or Uber, you can actually use AI to turbocharge those network effects. So what I have in mind is like, now you get AI, you can also add data network effects, right? So you can see like, you can just extract more, you can learn more by using AI what are the preferences of various buyers and sellers, customize better, predict better, help with pricing, help sellers set better prices and so on. So I think those will definitely benefit. Now, there's a category of marketplaces which are typically intermediating purely online services. Those, I think, actually, like some of them at least are being disrupted by AI and Gen AI. So a good example is think about Upwork and Fiverr. I have to believe there's some of their categories, some of the job categories that are being intermediated on Fiverr and Upwork are basically going to be kind of severely disrupted by generative AI, like coding, web design, and stuff like that. Now, an interesting thing, so I was writing something about Gen AI, and I looked a little bit closer at Upwork. So yeah, if you look at their stock price, like in 2023, they got kind of punished for that. But at some point, their stock price jumped up, and I looked at like why the stock price jumped up. And interestingly enough, they did a deal with OpenAI. And the deal is for Upwork to have a category of jobs, which is you can hire people who are specialists in ChatGPT implementation, which I think is very interesting. So it's again, I would say even the marketplaces who are like most likely to be disrupted, there's always ways to turn this into an opportunity. It's like, yes, there's going to be some job categories that are going to be disrupted. By the way, more interesting. So this is like AI and the established ones, lots of interesting things there. Again, I'll say to me, what the most interesting thing is, does AI or Gen AI, do they open up opportunities for completely new marketplaces that we haven't seen before? I don't have something specific in mind, but I'm sure there will be. Like say a completely new type of marketplace, something where you're trading data or something. There has to be. Like at some point, I'm certain that there will be, and I think those will be very interesting.
No, certainly. It's going to be really interesting to see that kind of play out. So, that's a somewhat related kind of topic on that, that I thought was worth discussing as far as marketplace defensibility, right? And we're constantly seeing kind of marketplaces, being reinvented, with the new entrants versus kind of incumbents. So how do you think about marketplace defensibility?
So, I think defensibility is one of the things one of the main things to always worry about. I remember there's this very good post by Not Boring. So, he said like a lot of people think like defensibility is something that you worry about reaching product market fit. And that's a mistake because the point is, if you reach product market fit, then everybody's going to jump in. So it might be too late. So you should actually, because once it's obvious that this is a good idea, then that's where you should be already defensible. Otherwise, you're going to be drowned in competition. So you should think about it very, very early on. So certainly part of the spirit of those 6 questions is to get at defensibility. So again, for example, if multi-homing, if you provide incentives for your buyers and sellers to mostly stick exclusively with you, that makes you more defensible. If the network effects are stronger, you're more defensible. Another criteria is, so for example, global. Yeah, if you have a global marketplace, if you manage to get past the chicken and egg problem, there's going to be more defensible than local network effect marketplaces, because if it's just local, you start in the cities A and B, I could start in cities C and D, right? So like it makes it easier to compete. There's a few other dimensions in there which we haven't spoken about. So for example, so in terms of defensibility, I'd much prefer marketplaces where the supply side is heavily differentiated as opposed to commodity, right? So that's a pretty big one. A good example would be, so think about Uber and Lyft. I mean, they're good businesses, but I think everybody sees that there's an issue, which is the supply side is undifferentiated. I'm sorry, these are drivers, like as long as they can drive and they have a car, like we don't really care, right? Airbnb, there's definitely more differentiation. Like 2 apartments are not quite the same. If you think about, I don't know, Cameo, or like there are other more extreme examples, right? Yeah, 2 celebrities are not the same. So differentiation makes the marketplace more defensible. If it's commodity, then any other marketplace can pull from the same undifferentiated supply. So it makes it less defensible.
I know that's going to lead to some questions here. So speaking of, we're going to jump into the group Q&A here in a second. But, right before we do though, so you've of course spent, as I mentioned earlier, almost like 2 decades now kind of studying marketplaces. So I'm sure you've seen quite a few also, mistakes that they've kind of made over the course of time. So, what do you think some of the biggest, I would say, like maybe misconceptions or mistakes are around marketplaces?
That's a good one. I mean, I'm sure there are other people that have seen more. So the one I'll just say what first comes to mind. So the first one is the issue of leakage. So the leakage or disintermediation. So this is the idea that, your marketplace offers discovery, so buyers and sellers meet, but you have a hard time keeping the transactions on the platform because you don't offer enough value after discovery, right? So this is something I think a lot of people can relate to. I've seen at least a couple marketplaces that have never truly, I'm not going to name them, but it's been very frustrating to see like lots of potential, but they never truly seriously address this problem. And it's just basically like you're trying to carry water with, what is it, like with a bullet ridden like a kettle, right? It's just like you're getting water and it's like the water keeps leaking out. It's just like it's quite painful to see. So I think it's something. Again, I think it's something. It's something in some context. By the way, leakage is very hard to address. Like if the buyer and sellers meet in person, if they want to transact repeatedly, okay, I understand it's harder, but there's always things you can do. Like there are always incentives you can provide to make it better. So I think that's a big one. Yeah, the other one I think it's just where we talk about defensibility. So like, worrying a little bit too much about like let's get product market fit and not worrying about like building barriers to entry like early on. So I think I know it sounds a bit general, but I think that's always an issue with marketplaces.
Those are going to be super helpful. So, hey, Dimitri, do you want to come on? Familiar face?
Hi, Andrei. Good to see you.
Dimitri.
I had a question about this kind of question. It came up a little bit earlier in the talk about kind of competition and multi-homing across platforms. So I was curious what you think about policies where like you effectively platform can set a minimum price. And if a supplier multi-homes across multiple platforms, they just can't charge a lower price somewhere else. So kind of a minimum.
Yeah. So again, you want to be sure like the antitrust regulators don't hear you proposing something like that. So that's like called price parity. And it's like, if you're a large platform, this is definitely not something you want to do. Like a lot of the large platforms got in hot water for this. Amazon quietly, basically they got sued or whatever, like the FTC went after them. They quietly removed that. And if you're small, I don't think you have the authority to do it. Basically, it's like you don't have enough power to force that.
Okay.
So, I mean, yeah, I think I would try to stay away from price. I would definitely again, both for large and for small, I would stay away from price parity rules. Again, I know like the temptation is to go to suppliers, hey, be exclusive with me. So that conversation, to me, it's like, it can't be exclusive or else, right? It should be more like, if you're exclusive to me, like here's all these benefits that you get, right? Or like, okay, you can participate on other platforms, but if you mostly work with me, like, you'll get preferential access to buyers or something like that. So I think that's a much better way to think about it.
Awesome. Appreciate it. I know you guys had a thread in the community as well. So cool. Hey, Luis, do you want to come on?
Thanks. Hi, Andrei. How are you doing? I'm from Sabroso. What we are doing basically is a marketplace for low-cost meals in Latam. So picture like something like Rappi or Uber Eats, but aiming for low cost and aiming for companies, right? So my question is, how would you recommend we calculate like the liquidity of the marketplace, and what's the sweet spot to aim for the first steps? Like according in the trends, right? Like for 1,000 users, what's the sweet spot? For like 10,000, what's the sweet spot? Like that.
So your users are companies, is that correct? They're businesses?
Yeah, there are companies and workforces in Latam. Like for example, if you're in an office space or if you are in a company that gives food to their employees.
And the supply, so what's the supply side?
The chefs or the restaurants that cook for these companies.
Right. I mean, so again, what's interesting with this is like each user, quote unquote, if it's a business, it depends how large it is, right? Like and in some sense, it makes it, again, I don't think it's a magic formula, but it's easier than getting users like individual consumers one by one, because presumably if you get like one or two big companies, you already have a bunch of liquidity, right? If you have a couple companies and they have many, I don't know, like hundreds of employees, and then they order like, they also have predictable demand, which is nice. Maybe they say like, we're going to order 2 or 3 times a week. I think that's awesome. So in some sense, I would say for you, is like, I wouldn't worry, like, what's the formula for liquidity? I would just get a bunch of companies like this and make sure you have, you have enough demand, you get that to work, and then maybe you ask them like half, and then you start saying, okay, well, now you're getting food from this one or two restaurants. I mean, would you like to switch around like every month or something? Do you want to try different? And then you bring new chefs. Again, this is the type of marketplace where I would say it's less fragmented than the usual like individual consumer with individual chef or something, which I think has the advantage that it makes it easier to get past the chicken and egg problem and get liquidity.
Yeah, I mean, right now we're aiming for both spaces in the B2B and the B2C. But yeah, frankly, the B2B is the one that scales the most faster because
Exactly.
the company represents 500 users.
I think there's lots of good things about it. Like, what I wrote in the sort of in the article. So I'd say, so here's how I think about this. Fragmentation, by the way, is another big question for marketplaces. So eventually what I want fragmentation. The more fragmented, the better, because the stronger network effects. However, in the early stages, fragmentation makes the chicken and egg problem harder, right? So if you're in a situation like yours, you can start like not very fragmented. So you get these big users on either side. That's great. But after, so what I think once you get the ball rolling, once you get a few, like, start, like you said, B2B or B2C, once you get those, I would definitely start adding consumers. Again, I want, like, if you like to get this marketplace to like the bigger network effect, eventually you want it to be more fragmented, but it makes it easier. Like once you get the businesses, then it's easier to say, well, okay, now I have these chefs, if they have additional capacity, well, now they can basically they can also serve consumers.
Well, cool. So we're almost out of time here, Andre, but I really appreciate, taking the time to join us here today. So this is a fun chat. And, I know we covered lots of ground here, with some of your posts and also some of the group Q&A, kind of almost like workshopping through some of these topics and questions. So we really appreciate, joining us here. Had one last question for you before we wrap things up, which is if you could go right back to before you entered the world of marketplaces, what would you tell yourself about them?
That's a very good one. I should know because I listened to your podcast and I should have prepared. So I actually didn't prepare, but now that you got me, I have no choice but to be sincere. I guess if I had thought about it a little bit more, so especially knowing what I know now, I think I would have so I've approached this for many years just from pure academic standpoint. I should have thought harder and realized how much business potential there is. So I should have either tried to start a marketplace. I should have definitely tried to start a marketplace just for the fun of it, and maybe like started investing and like actually like, be active in the real world of marketplaces a lot earlier.
Well, it's really good to have you on here. So I know, once again, we covered lots of ground. And last but not least, time for a quick plug. Where can we keep up with you at?
So I'm on Twitter, so the platform guy on Twitter. And I also have, I think, by the way, the most relevant for everybody here, I have a Substack. So it's called Platform Chronicles at substack.com. And a lot of these posts on marketplaces are there. Whenever I have a Harvard Business Review article, I post it there as well.
Awesome. We'll include links, and I know you'll have lots of founders coming your way. So we really appreciate it. And thanks everyone for joining in the great questions.